At 2:27 a.m., I used to step onto my porch with a tin cup of black coffee and listen to the woods, counting the silence between sounds. In the fall of 1991, I stood there with my finger on the trigger when a human voice came out of the dark and said, "Stop." My name is James Morgan. I was 60 when I finally started putting this to words, and I'd spent most of my life as a logger in the backwoods. Old school work, the kind that leaves you quiet by the end of the day because you've already said everything that matters with your hands. I wasn't a dreamer. I wasn't a man who went looking for myths. I liked straight lines, simple tools, and mornings that smelled like bar oil, sawdust, and cold metal. A few years before all this started, I lost someone close, my wife, Mary, the one person who could pull a laugh out of me even when the world felt like it had turned to gray ash. After she was gone, the house got too big and too still, and I learned the hard way that silence can either heal you or hollow you out. I chose work. I chose the woods. I chose the honest exhaustion of a day that ends with your shoulders burning and your mind too tired to chase ghosts. But it all started in the fall of 1991, before anyone in my town was talking about strange tracks, or before I had a habit of standing at 2:17 like I was waiting for a bell to ring. That autumn came early and damp, the kind of season where the fog sits low over the ground all morning and the sky never quite decides to clear. We were cutting on a tract not far from my place, running old equipment that rattled and complained like a tired animal, and every evening I came home with the smell of pine sap in my clothes and a fine dust in my hair that no shower could fully wash away. I lived out far enough that the road to my cabin turned to gravel and then to something more like a suggestion, and at night the dark felt thick, not empty. It wasn't fear, it was weight. The woods have their own rules, and if you spend your life in them, you learn not to argue. One night, late, cold, with a thin rain tapping the roof like a nervous knuckle, I heard a sound that didn't belong to wind or deer or any of the usual nightlife. It was heavy, but not clumsy, more like something large trying very hard not to be heard. A slow compression of wet leaves, a pause, then another step, placed with intention. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, the refrigerator humming, my coffee gone lukewarm, listening with my head tilted the way you listen for a child moving in the next room. The sound came again, closer, near the shed where I kept my extra fuel and tools. Out where I lived, you didn't ignore that, not because you're itching to shoot something, but because a man alone has responsibilities, to himself, to his property, to the simple fact that if something goes wrong, help is not around the corner. I took my rifle from the rack by the door the way you take a flashlight, a tool, nothing more. I eased the porch door open, and the cold hit my face like a wet rag. The air smelled of damp cedar and old smoke from my stove. The porch light cast a weak yellow cone that didn't reach the tree line, and beyond it, the forest was a wall of deeper dark. I stepped down slow, boots finding the slick boards, and every little sound I made felt loud, the creak of a step, the faint clink of the sling swivel. The rain had turned the yard to soft mud. Somewhere off to my left, the shed was a darker shape against the darker woods. Then I saw it. Not a full outline at first, just a thickness where there shouldn't have been thickness, like the night had grown a shoulder and leaned forward. A silhouette at the edge of my light, tall enough that it made the trees behind it look smaller, standing still as if it had been standing there a long time and only now decided to let me notice. My mouth went dry. I could hear my own breath, shallow and careful, and the way the blood in my ears felt the world distant.
I raised the rifle, not dramatic, not quick, just the way a man does when he thinks he might be looking at a bear. The stock was cold against my cheek. My finger found the trigger without thought, the familiar curve, the slight resistance. I remember how my hand wanted to do what it had been trained to do: protect, react, solve the problem before it became one. The sight settled, and for one sharp second, my whole world narrowed to the space between my front post and the center of that dark mass. And then, from that darkness, a voice said, plain and steady, "Stop." Not a howl, not a grunt, not some animal noise you could explain away. A word, human-shaped. The sound of it hit me like a shove. My trigger didn't pull, it locked. My wrist went numb. I tried to swallow, and there was no spit to swallow. My chest tightened like my ribs had decided to hold the air hostage. The rifle trembled just enough that I could feel it through the wood. The figure stepped a half pace into the thin edge of light, and for the first time I saw texture. Dark hair clumped with moisture, a broad chest, shoulders that looked built for carrying weight, and a face that wasn't a man's and wasn't an animal's either, something in between that made my mind stall out, searching for a category and finding none. Its eyes caught the porch light and didn't shine like a deer's, they just looked back. There was intelligence there, and something else I wasn't ready to name. Calm, maybe, or patience, like it had been waiting for this moment to go one way or another and was prepared for either. It didn't rush me, it didn't bare teeth. It held its hands low, open, showing me it wasn't trying to hurt me. My voice came out rough and small, not the voice of a man in control. "What are you?" I said, and even as I said it, I knew how stupid it sounded, like asking the rain why it falls. It didn't answer that. It spoke again, and the words were few, chosen like stones. "Don't," it said. "No need." The way it said it, firm but not angry, made my trigger finger feel ashamed, like a child caught doing something cruel. I kept the rifle up because I didn't know what else to do, but my aim lowered without me deciding.
The figure's gaze stayed on my face, not on the gun. It said, "No, shoot." Slower this time, and then after a pause, "Not here." I didn't move. I listened the way you listen when an older man tells you something that will cost you if you ignore it. The rain ticked on my hat brim. Somewhere in the woods a branch snapped, and the figure's head turned a fraction toward the sound, alert, then back to me, as if it was keeping track of everything at once. I managed, "Why are you here?" It didn't give me a story. It didn't plead. It didn't explain itself like a man would. It just set a boundary. "No people," it said, and the words landed heavy. Then it lifted one hand and pointed, not at me, but outward, toward the road, toward the world. "You, no tell." The gesture was simple, but the meaning was sharp as a blade. Keep this between us, or it ends badly. My hands were shaking now, not from cold, from the fact that my life, my quiet, my grief, my whole sense of what was possible had just been cracked open. I could have shouted, I could have run inside and locked the door, I could have fired out of panic and spent the rest of my days trying to scrub that sound out of my head. Instead, I did the only honest thing I could think to do. I lowered the rifle fully, set the butt to the wet ground, and lifted my left hand, palm out, the way you show someone you're not reaching for anything. "Okay," I said. One word.
an agreement. The figure watched me for a long moment, then nodded once, small, almost respectful, like two men making a deal without paperwork. It took a step back into the darkness, and the night swallowed most of it again, leaving only that sense of mass and presence. Before it disappeared completely, it said one more thing, softer, as if it wasn't meant for the air, but for my decision. "Quiet," it said. Then it was gone. No crashing through brush, no dramatic exit, just a shift of shadow and the absence of it, like it had never been there at all. I stood in my yard with the rain soaking my shoulders and the rifle heavy in my hands, and I realized the silence around my cabin had changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied. When I finally went back inside, I locked the door out of habit, not because a lock meant anything, and I sat at my kitchen table until my coffee went cold again, staring at nothing and listening to my own breathing like it belonged to someone else. I didn't tell a soul, not the men at the mill, not the sheriff, not the one friend who still stopped by sometimes on Sundays. I told myself it was because nobody would believe me, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I understood, all at once, what kind of people a story like this attracts, and how easily a living thing can become a prize when enough mouths start repeating its name. A few weeks later, on a night even colder than the first, it came back, standing beyond the porch light like it was honoring the line it had drawn. And I knew I was going to step outside again, because a man can carry grief alone, but he can't carry a truth like that without it changing him. And that second night, when the rain stopped and the forest held its breath, we talked longer than I'd talked to anyone in years.
By the time the leaves had turned and fallen again, by the time 1992 came in with wet wind and early darkness, I'd stopped telling myself that what happened in my yard was a mistake of the mind. I tried at first. I tried the way a practical man tries to fix something that doesn't fit. I replayed angles, distance, light, the way sound carries through timber, the way loneliness can make a person hear what he wants to hear. But every time I put my boots on after supper and caught the smell of damp cedar on the air, my hands remembered the weight of the rifle and the way my finger had locked instead of pulling. I didn't go back out because I wanted a story to tell. I went back because I needed an explanation that didn't make me feel like my own mind had turned against me. After work one evening, cold enough that the sawdust on my jacket felt stiff, and the drive home in my old truck was nothing but heater rattle and the weak yellow of headlights, I didn't go straight inside. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there listening to the tick of cooling metal. The woods beyond my porch were a solid black wall. I poured coffee into that same dented tin cup and waited until 2:17 like it mattered, because after a certain age, you don't have many rituals left that still mean something. When the minute hand settled, I stepped off the porch and walked toward the tree line. Not fast, not sneaking, just steady, the way you walk when you don't want to startle something that has already proven it can startle you. I carried no rifle that night. That was my first quiet decision. If I was going to meet whatever it was again, I wanted my hands empty. The ground was soft with recent rain, and the cold had that particular bite where it doesn't sting your skin so much as it drains the warmth out of your bones. Somewhere high up, the branches hissed in the wind, and from farther off came the faint, constant hum of the highway that cut through the valley, never loud, never gone, like an engine idling in the back of the world. I stopped at the edge of the light from my porch and let the darkness take me in. For a long time, nothing moved. I watched my own breath float and vanish. I listened to the small living sounds, an owl shifting, a mouse in leaves, the drip of water from a limb.
Then, without warning and without drama, the shape was there again, deeper than shadow, taller than a man, standing where the trees began to thicken. It didn't step into the light. It didn't need to. I knew it the way you know a mountain is there, even when clouds cover it. "You came," it said, and my throat tightened because it wasn't just a word anymore. It was a sentence, a choice, a recognition. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, partly because I didn't know what to say, and partly because something in me understood that silence was part of the language here. When I finally spoke, it came out low. "I needed to know," I said, "what you are, why you're here." The figure shifted slightly, and I heard the wet press of leaves under a foot. "Name," it said, tapping its own chest with a thick finger. "Kuranda." The sound wasn't English the way my name was English, but it was shaped for my mouth to say, and when I tried it, Kuranda, it gave a slow, almost satisfied nod. I didn't ask where it lived or if there were more. I didn't ask the questions people would ask if they wanted proof. I asked the question a lonely man asks when he stands in the dark, talking to something that shouldn't exist. "Why talk to me?" I said. Kuranda was quiet for a long moment, and in that pause, I realized how much noise I had been living in without noticing. Saws, engines, radios, the constant chatter of other men at the mill, even the television I kept on some nights just to keep the house from feeling like a tomb. Out here, the pauses were clean. Out here, you could hear your own thoughts scrape. "You listen," Kuranda said. "People don't listen. People take." It didn't say it like an accusation. It said it like a weather report, a fact observed over a long time. I swallowed and looked down at my boots, at the wet needles stuck to the tread.
"Take what?" I asked, short because longer questions felt like too much. Kuranda lifted one arm and made a slow, sweeping motion toward the valley, toward where the dark land flattened into farms and town lights. "One thing," it said, and the word it used sounded like corn, but heavier, like it meant more than a crop. "Only one. Same, same, same." I understood anyway. I'd driven past fields where everything grew uniform and bright, fields where the edges were scraped clean, where the windbreak trees had been cut because they were in the way. "Monoculture," I said, surprised to hear the big word come out of my mouth. "That's what they call it." Kuranda didn't repeat my word. It didn't need to. "Forest is many," it said. "Many plants, many small lives, many." It crouched slightly, and though I couldn't see its hands clearly, I heard it rake the damp ground, drawing lines in the mud. "You make one," it said. "You kill the rest. Poison." The way it said poison made my stomach clench because I could picture the barrels I'd seen, the sprayed edges, the dead strip between field and creek. "People say it's efficient," I muttered, more to myself than to it. Kuranda made a sound that might have been a breath or a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Efficient," it repeated slowly, tasting the word like it was bitter. "You have machines. You work more. You hurry more. You are less." That hit me harder than it should have, because it was true in a way I'd never admitted. My father cut with hand tools and horses when he was young, and he came home tired, but he still sat with his neighbors on the porch. In my time, we had chainsaws and skidders and radios, and everything was faster, and yet the men I worked with looked worn thin, like the speed had eaten the joy out of them. I stared into the dark where Kuranda's face would be. "How you know about our machines?" I asked. Kuranda tilted its head toward the faint hum of the highway. "Noise," it said. "Always noise now." He pointed a thick finger toward my cabin. "Box," it said, and I felt my cheeks warm because I knew exactly what it meant. My television, my radio, the way I let voices fill my room so I didn't have to sit with my own thoughts. "Box makes head loud," Kuranda said.
You forget you're inside quiet. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I thought of evenings when I'd come home, eaten standing up, and turned on the TV without even caring what was on, just so the walls wouldn't echo. People are alone, Karanda continued, and this time its voice lowered like it was stepping onto softer ground. Many people, town full, but hearts separate. It brought his hands close together, almost touching, then pulled them apart. They stand close, it said, but they don't see. The wind shifted and brought me the smell of wet bark and distant smoke. I thought of the grocery store in town, the way folks avoided eye contact, the way everyone hurried as if time was a debt collector. "Wasn't always like that," I said, surprising myself. "When I was a boy, my grandparents lived with us. They taught me things." Karanda's head turned slightly, as if it was listening not just to my words, but to what sat behind them. "Old ones," it said, "you don't keep." It tapped its chest again, then pointed outward, away. My throat tightened because I'd seen it. Nursing homes on the edge of town, elders parked in front of televisions, their stories drying up inside them because nobody asked. Mary used to talk about her father's hands, the way he could fix anything, and how she feared all that knowledge would just vanish. "We lost the chain," I whispered. Karanda didn't answer right away. The silence between us felt like a third presence. Then it said, "Climate change," in a rough approximation of the sounds, not like it had read it somewhere, but like it had heard people say it and carried the meaning. "Hotter, less snow, rivers smaller." It drew another line in the mud, shorter than the first. "When I was young," it said, and the phrase made my skin prickle because it meant it had a past long enough to measure seasons against. Winter was deeper. Now winter is thin. I thought of the creek behind my place, how it had run hard when I first bought the land, and how lately in late summer you could see rocks that used to be underwater. I thought of fire seasons that seemed to come earlier every year. "People don't notice," Karanda said as if reading my thoughts. "Short life, they think now is normal." It paused, and when it spoke again, the words came slower, heavier. "You run," it said. "All humans run, fast, faster, through dark woods."
It lifted its hand and made a forward-pushing gesture, as if urging something on. "They don't see Cliff. When water starts going, they can't stop." That image sat in my chest like a stone. I'd watched men ruin their bodies chasing overtime, watched families split because everyone was too tired to be kind, watched neighbors lock their doors, not because crime was rampant, but because trust had become rare. "People don't trust," Karanda said, and the way it said it sounded like sorrow, not judgment. "They build walls, they hold weapons, they think other people are danger." It looked, truly looked, at the empty space where my hands hung at my sides. "You held weapon," it said quietly, "but you stopped." I felt my face tighten, and I realized I was clenching my jaw. "I almost didn't," I admitted. I couldn't finish it. Karanda let the silence hold the rest. Then it said, "Choice," and that one word felt like a gift and a burden at the same time. We talked like that for a long time, not in long speeches, but in slow exchanges and pauses where the forest did its own talking, wind through needles, the distant crack of a tree settling, the soft rush of a night bird's wings. I asked a few small questions, where it went when it left, what it ate, whether it ever came close to town, and Karanda answered just enough. It liked sweet things more than meat. It avoided roads. It watched people the way people watched weather, never trying to change it, only trying to survive it. At some point, it stepped closer, not into my light, but close enough that I could smell it. Damp earth, old bark, something like smoke that had lived in fur for years. It didn't touch me. It didn't need to. It lifted one hand and pointed to a spot beyond the tree line, a large rock half buried in moss. "There," it said, "when moon like this." It pointed to the sky where clouds thinned and a pale slice of moon showed through. Then it pointed to my porch. "No other time," it said, "no other place." I nodded once. "A signal?" I asked. Karanda picked up a broken branch and snapped it clean, then laid the pieces in an X on the ground. "If danger," it said, and then it made a circling motion with its hand, like a wheel turning. "People close." It took the branch pieces and scattered them, erasing the X. "If safe," it said, and set the X again. Simple, practical, the kind of system two cautious creatures would make when neither can afford mistakes. When I finally turned to go back, Karanda didn't follow. It just stood there and watched until I reached the edge of my porch light. And before I stepped up, it said one last thing, softer than the rest. "Quiet is life." I went inside and sat at my kitchen table with my hands wrapped around that tin cup, not drinking, just holding warmth, and I realized I'd spent years trying to fill my house with noise so I wouldn't feel alone, but the first real company I'd had in a long time came from the one place I'd always trusted to be honest, the dark woods. Over the weeks that followed, I kept the agreement. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even let myself say the name out loud in daylight. The meetings were rare, sometimes once a month, sometimes less, and when they happened, they felt like something you earned, not something you owned. I stopped leaving the television on when I ate. I started turning the radio off in the truck for the last mile home just to hear the tires on gravel and the wind in the trees. I didn't preach. I didn't turn into a saint. I just changed small habits the way a man changes his grip when a tool has taught him a lesson. Then, one evening, not long after the first snow dusted the high ridges, I found fresh boot prints near the edge of the forest, where nobody had any business being that late, the tread pattern sharp in the damp earth, and beside them, a cigarette butt still pale against the dark soil. I stood there a long time with my hands on my hips, staring at those tracks, and the same cold that had hit my face the first night crept into my stomach, because I understood something plain. If people started saying this out loud, if the story got carried from mouth to mouth, it wouldn't be hunters or drunks who came looking first. It would be the kind of men who don't come for wonder, only for control.
By 1994, the woods hadn't changed much to the eye. Same ridge lines, same dark stands of fir and cedar, the same damp mornings where fog sat low and the smell of wet bark got into your clothes. But the people around them had changed, and I learned that the quickest way to ruin a quiet place isn't a bulldozer or a fire, it's a mouth that won't stay shut. It started small, like most trouble does. A couple of men at the mill joked about something big crossing the access road up near the old cut. A cashier at the feed store said a hunter had come in asking for extra .30-06 rounds in case the bear isn't a bear. A kid in town swore up and down he'd seen footprints behind the high school field after a rain, prints too long to be real. And the old-timers rolled their eyes the way they always did, half annoyed, half entertained, because stories are cheap entertainment when you don't think they can touch your life. I heard it all without reacting, keeping my face neutral like I'd learned to do when a foreman is looking for volunteers. Inside, though, my stomach stayed tight. I'd been meeting Karanda rarely, carefully, for years by then, and every time I stepped out at night, I felt the weight of what I was protecting. Not a secret to brag about, but a living line that could be crossed and never uncrossed. I stopped going to the diner on Sunday mornings. I started buying gas at odd hours. I listened more than I spoke,
and I learned how rumors move, not like a flood, but like seepage, quiet and persistent, finding every crack in a community. One afternoon in late 1995, when the leaves were already turning and the air had that crisp edge that makes you think of frost even when the sun is out, I saw a car I didn't recognize parked near the post office. Not a local truck, a clean sedan with plates from farther away. Then another, darker one, idling near the cafe. A day later, a third vehicle, this one an older government-looking rig, the kind of plain color that tries not to be remembered. It's a strange thing living in a small town. You can feel an outsider the way you can feel a change in barometric pressure. Nobody said anything at first, not directly. People just watched from behind their own caution, and the air got a little sharper. I told myself it might be about something else, timber disputes, land surveys, missing hikers, any of the normal reasons strangers show up with clipboards. But the timing sat wrong. The talk had been building, and talk attracts attention the way a bright porch light attracts moths. The first time they came to my place, it was mid-morning, a weekday, while I was home doing repairs on a saw chain at my workbench. I heard tires on gravel, slow and deliberate, not the quick roll of a neighbor stopping by. When I stepped out, wiping my hands on a rag, there were 2 vehicles in my drive. 3 men and a woman got out. They weren't movie villains. They weren't wearing tactical gear. They looked like people who had learned to keep their expressions even. Plain jackets, sturdy boots, hair cut short, and eyes that moved over the property without looking like they were staring. One of them held a folder. Another carried a camera that wasn't fancy, just functional. The woman introduced herself with a name I didn't catch and showed me a badge so quickly it felt like a trick. It wasn't a sheriff's badge. It wasn't Forest Service. It was something else, something with an edge of authority I couldn't place. And what I felt wasn't fear exactly. It was that official cold Kuranda had warned me about in his own way. The kind of cold that doesn't care what a thing is, only what it can be turned into.
"Mr. Morgan?" the man with the folder asked, and I nodded. He asked a few questions that sounded casual, but weren't. Had I seen anything unusual? Had I heard reports of large animals? Had I noticed trespassers or strange tracks on my land? Had I ever found signs of someone camping where they shouldn't? I answered like a man who has worked around inspections his whole life. Short, honest enough to be believable, empty of unnecessary detail. "No," I said, "just deer, bears sometimes, folks cutting through now and then." The woman looked past me toward the tree line and said, "You live alone out here?" Her voice was polite, but the question had weight. "Yes," I said. "My wife passed." A pause. The kind of pause that isn't sympathy, just a note taken. They asked if they could take a quick look around. I had the right to say no, and I knew it, but I also knew a man can be right and still be ruined. I agreed, because refusal can be its own kind of spotlight. "Stay close," I said, as if I was worried about them getting lost. And in a way I was. Not lost in the woods, lost in what the woods can hide. They walked, slow and methodical, eyes scanning for signs that meant something to them. They looked at the edge of my shed, the ground near my woodpile, the line where my yard became forest. One of them crouched and touched the soil, then rubbed it between his fingers. Another lifted his camera and took a few pictures of nothing in particular. "We've had reports," the folder man said, almost conversational, "of large prints in the region. People get excited. Sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's something else." He said it like he didn't care which. I kept my face still. "This is logging country," I said. "People see shadows and make stories." He looked at me for a long moment, and for a second I thought he could hear my heartbeat.
Then he nodded as if I'd confirmed something he already believed, and they moved on. The whole time they were on my property, my mind was working the way it worked on a dangerous felling job. Quiet, fast calculations, no wasted motion. I thought of the places Kuranda and I met, the rock with moss, the little X of snapped branches, the tin cup smell of coffee in the night air. None of it was dramatic, but any pattern can become evidence if the wrong person stands close enough. As soon as they left my yard and drifted toward the tree line, I excused myself like I needed to use the bathroom, stepped inside, and did the first thing I always did when I needed to think straight. I turned off every sound. No radio, no TV, no running water, just the quiet. Then I went to my back door and watched through the glass as they walked along the edge of the woods. They didn't enter far. They didn't crash through brush. They stayed where their shoes wouldn't sink too deep, where they could still claim it was a quick look. After they drove away, dust hanging in my driveway like a question, I didn't stand there wringing my hands. I got to work. That's the difference between panic and responsibility. Panic makes noise. Responsibility makes plans. I walked to the meeting place before dark, moving off my usual path, stepping where needles were thick so my prints wouldn't read clean. At the rock, I didn't leave the X. I erased it. I took the snapped branches and broke them smaller and scattered them into the understory like they'd always been there. I brushed the ground with a pine bough to soften any marks. I didn't do it like a criminal. I did it like a man tidying up after himself because the wrong kind of attention had drifted too close. That night, when the time came, I didn't stand on my porch with coffee. I waited in the deeper dark, farther out, where the porch light couldn't betray me. When Kuranda appeared, silent, inevitable, I didn't waste words. I held my hand low, palm down, and pressed it toward the earth, the way you tell a dog to stay. "Quiet," I said. Then I pointed down the slope, away from the usual place. "Lower," I added. And then, because I needed him to understand the shape of this danger, I made a circle in the air with my finger, like wheels turning, like people circling. Kuranda didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He watched my face the way he always did, and in his eyes I saw the same understanding I'd seen the first night. Not fear, not confusion, but a clean recognition of cause and effect. He made one sound, soft, almost a breath, and then he stepped back and vanished into the timber with a smoothness that still makes me shake my head when I remember it. There was no trail, no snapped branches, no rush of movement. He simply stopped being where he had been, as if the forest had opened and closed around him. Over the next few days, the town's talk shifted to something else, like it always does. Someone's divorce, a wreck on the highway, a new foreman at the mill. The strangers stopped showing up at the cafe. The sedans disappeared from the post office lot. The plain vehicles quit idling at the edge of town. And then, as suddenly as they'd arrived, they were gone. No farewell, no explanation, no closure, just the absence of them. The relief I felt wasn't a burst of happiness. It was more like unclenching a fist you hadn't realized you'd been holding shut for days. That winter, when the rain came hard and the nights grew longer, Kuranda and I met even less. Weeks went by without a sign. When he did appear, it was always deeper now, farther from any path, and our words were fewer because we both understood the new rule that had been written without ink. The world might not be hunting, but it listens, and all it takes is one good rumor carried to the wrong ear. I learned something in those years that no sermon could have taught me. Quiet isn't a gift the woods give you. Quiet is work. Quiet is choosing what you don't say, where you don't step, how you keep your hands.
Quiet is responsibility, carried day after day, even when nobody sees you carrying it. And once you've carried it for something that can't defend itself against human curiosity, the weight doesn't make you proud, it just makes you careful and a little older, even before the years catch up.
By 1997, I could feel age in the small places first. The way my knees talked back when I stepped down from the porch, the way my fingers took longer to warm around a mug, the way I started keeping my tools sharper because my strength wasn't as forgiving as it used to be. I still worked, though not like I did in the early 90s, and the men at the mill started calling me Old James with that half-joking respect folks give you when they've watched you endure without making a show of it. The world kept getting louder in its steady, ordinary way. More trucks on the highway, more radios blaring through open windows in town, more people in a hurry, as if being slow was a kind of failure. But my ritual stayed the same, not because it was superstition, and not because I believed in controlling anything, but because it reminded me that quiet still existed if you were willing to meet it on its own terms. At 2:17 a.m., on nights when my body allowed it, and my mind wouldn't settle, I stepped out with a tin cup of coffee and let the forest take the noise out of me. I didn't always go all the way to the meeting place anymore. Sometimes I only stood on the porch and listened, feeling the cold seep through my socks, smelling wet cedar and old smoke, letting the silence do its slow work. And when I did go, it was never with expectation. Karanda and I had learned after the strangers came and went that expectation is the quickest way to make a pattern, and patterns are what people find. Our meetings became rare enough that each one felt like a season marker. A snapped branch laid in a certain way meant safe. A rock turned on its side meant wait. And sometimes there was nothing at all, just the woods, and the understanding that the most respectful thing you can do for another living being is let it stay hidden when it wants to stay hidden. When Karanda did appear in those later years, it was always deeper, always on the edge of my vision rather than in it, a presence more than a shape. But the calm in him had thickened into something like trust. Not trust the way people mean it, full of words and promises and brittle expectations, but trust the way a river trusts a bank, by returning again and again, by not trying to break what holds it. I noticed changes in him, too, small signs that time touches everything. He moved a little slower on wet ground. He took longer to step out of shadow. Once, in the winter of 1998, I saw him rub at his shoulder as if a joint had gone stiff, and it hit me with a strange tenderness, because until then I'd held him in my mind as something outside the human calendar, a legend walking without age. Seeing him have a weakness didn't make him lesser, it made him more real, and it made my responsibility feel less like a duty and more like kinship. The last strong conversation we had, strong not because it was dramatic, but because it settled something in me, happened on a wet night in early fall of 1998, when the air smelled of mushrooms and damp soil and the first hints of rot in the leaves. I'd had a long day and an even longer week, the kind where your body is tired, but your mind keeps turning, chewing on old grief and new worries the way a dog chews a bone. I drove my old pickup out to the edge of my property line, killed the engine, and sat with my thermos between my knees, listening to the ticking metal cool down. The moon was thin behind cloud cover.
The woods were a black sea. I waited without calling, because we never called. After a while, I saw the shift that meant him, a deeper darkness moving within darkness, a tall form resolving near the familiar rock. I stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and held my hands where he could see them, palms open. He watched me for a long moment, and then, softly, he said my name,
James, not perfectly, but close enough that the sound tightened my throat. It wasn't a greeting so much as a proof that the years we'd shared hadn't been an illusion. I answered in the simplest way, the way you answer when the important things have already been said. "Kuranda," I said. We stood like that, two figures in the cold, breathing the same air, listening to the same wind. Finally, I asked the question that had been circling my thoughts more and more as my body reminded me I wasn't endless. "Do you ever get tired of hiding?" I kept my voice low, not because I feared the woods, but because the woods deserve low voices. Kuranda didn't respond right away. He turned his head slightly toward the valley, toward the faint glow of town lights that smeared the underside of the clouds. "People loud," he said. "People hungry." He paused, as if searching for a word that fit, and then he made a small motion with his hands, grabbing, pulling, like taking something that isn't offered. "They take," he said again, the same steady fact from years before. "They don't listen." I swallowed and nodded, because I'd seen it. I'd seen people treat each other like obstacles. I'd seen the way a story can become property once enough folks repeat it. "It's not all of them," I said, and even as I said it, I wasn't sure who I was defending, humans or my own need to believe in my species. Kuranda looked at me, and in that look I felt something like patience, as if he had room for our contradictions. "Some listen," he allowed. Then, gently, he tapped his chest and pointed at me. "You listen." I let that settle. The wind shifted. A branch creaked. Somewhere far off, a dog barked and then went quiet. I took a breath and said what had been hardest to admit. "I'm getting old," I said. It sounded plain and almost silly in the mouth, like stating that water is wet, but it carried weight because it meant change. It meant there would be a night I didn't step onto the porch, a winter I didn't drive out, a ritual I couldn't keep. Kuranda's posture changed a fraction. No panic, no drama, just a deeper focus, like an animal turning its full attention to something that matters. "Old," he repeated, and the word didn't sound like insult or pity. It sounded like recognition. He lifted his hand and made a slow circling gesture, not like wheels, but like seasons turning. "Forest, river, you." Then he did something I hadn't seen him do before. He stepped closer, not into my space like a threat, but into the edge of shared warmth, close enough that I could smell damp earth in his fur and feel, faintly, the heat of a living body radiating in the cold. He reached down, and I tensed out of instinct, then forced myself to loosen, because trust is also a choice you make with your muscles. From the shadow near his feet, he picked up something small and held it out, not in his palm like a gift wrapped in ceremony, but between his fingers like a simple offering. When I took it, my hand closed around metal, cold and familiar in a way that made my breath catch. It was my old pocket knife.
Not just any knife. My pocket knife from the early 80s. The one Mary had given me on an anniversary back when we still had more years ahead than behind. I'd lost it long ago, before I met Kuranda, dropped somewhere in these woods during a wet spring day, and searched for it until my knees ached and I had to accept it was gone. I turned it over in my palm, thumb finding the nick in the handle where I'd once dropped it on a rock, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The world narrowed to the weight of it, the cold bite of metal against skin, the sudden presence of Mary in my memory, like she'd stepped into the room. I looked up at Kuranda, and my voice came out rough. "You had this?" I asked. Kuranda tapped the knife lightly with one finger, then tapped his own chest,
then pointed at me. "Remember," he said. One word, not a sentimental speech, not a grand declaration, just a simple fact. I had been seen, watched, known, even before the night I raised a rifle and heard "stop." My grip tightened around the knife, and I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something steadier and harder to name, like gratitude mixed with grief. I swallowed and forced my jaw loose. "I never told anyone," I said, as if I needed him to know I'd kept the bargain. Karanda watched me for a long time, then nodded once, slow. "Good," he said. Then he looked toward the forest and made a small motion with his hand, not pointing, but indicating direction, back into the trees, back into the place where he belonged. Before he moved, he said something that landed in me and stayed. "Quiet is trust," he said. And I knew he wasn't talking only about sound. He meant the kind of quiet that doesn't demand, doesn't grab, doesn't turn a living thing into a story for other people to chew on. In 1999, the winter came wet and stubborn, and the nights felt heavier on my bones. I still drove my old pickup out on certain evenings, thermos beside me, the heater struggling, windshield wipers squeaking across cold glass. I still stepped out and smelled the rain and the needles, and listened to the forest settle. I didn't see Karanda often that year. Once I found the safe signal and left coffee and a slice of apple on the rock, and came back the next day to find only the apple gone and the coffee untouched, as if he'd taken what mattered and left the rest. Another time, after a storm, I found one large print pressed into the mud near the edge of my property. One print, not a trail, like a signature. No message, no spectacle, just proof that he was still there and still choosing discretion over drama. The last time I'm sure I saw him in the 90s was on a night when the rain had stopped and the forest held that deep, clean silence that feels like a held breath. He stood far back among the trees, barely more than a shape, and I didn't approach, I didn't call. I just lifted my hand once, palm out, and held it there until my shoulder ached. After a long moment, he lifted his own hand in the same gesture, and then he turned and moved away without sound, disappearing into the timber like a thought you can't hold on to, no matter how hard you try. I stood there with wet pine needles under my boots, the thermos cooling in my hand, and the pocket knife heavy in my jacket, like a small piece of my past returned. I didn't feel cheated by the distance. I felt honored by it, because the whole thing, every meeting, every rule, every careful step had never been about possession. It had been about respect. And if you've lived long enough, you learn that respect is rarer than proof. The world doesn't have to believe me. I don't need it to. It's enough for me to know that when the moment came, when fear would have been the easy answer, I didn't betray what was standing in the dark, asking for quiet.